are kicking off a brand new series today called You're Not the Boss of Me. And the tagline to this series is how to say no to the emotions that compete for control of our lives. How to say no to those emotions that kind of compete for our control. And this is something I know about you. I know it about myself, that you don't like anybody to tell you what to do. Right? That's just me? Okay. I don't like people to tell me what to do. I think we don't, whether it's something inside of us or somebody on the outside of us, we don't like innately to be told what to do, because the American dream, or the dream that we all have, is simply this. It's autonomy. We long for the day of autonomy. And autonomy, for our definition, is like, hey, it's being able to do what I want to do, when I want to do it, with enough money to pay for it, and maybe even enough money to be able to get me out of trouble if I get caught doing it. Right? It's just the full autonomy is being able to do what I want to do, when I want to do it, with enough money to pay for it. And then if that thing that you are wanting to do is maybe can get you in trouble, hey, there's a way out of it too. I can get out of this. And it's an alluring dream. It's an alluring dream, but basically it centers around this, because we're all convinced that once I can call my own shots, I'll call the right shots, right? Like when other people were telling me what to do, it's like, I wish I could just do it my way, because when I will do it my way, hey, this thing's going to blow up, it's going to get better, it's going to be bigger, because when I can call my own shots, I'm going to call the right shots every time. Does that get us in trouble sometimes? Gets us in trouble sometimes. It's why we're baffled by stories of autonomous people who are making just decisions that kind of undermine their autonomy. You know, once we hear someone's story, and we think always the same thing. We hear somebody's story, they make some bad decisions, they make some decisions that kind of undermine their autonomy, and we think that will never happen to us. If we were in that situation, I wouldn't make that decision. That would never happen to me. I would make better decisions, because once I can call my own shots, I'd always call the right shots. And maybe that's true. And in order for that to be so, there's something that we must kind of do. There's something that we must do if we're going to really have autonomy, we're really going to call the right shots. And it basically is this, that our need for supervision may someday come to an end if we silence the toxic voices that come from within. I know it rhymes. It's a poem. It's awesome. You can tweet it. Our need for supervision may someday come to an end if we can silence the toxic voices that come from within. Or maybe the negative version of it is our need of supervision will never come to an end until we silence the toxic voices that come from within. We don't get in trouble because we take advice. We get in trouble because we take our own advice a lot of times, right? And it gets filtered through these emotions that kind of are raging within us, that present us with a distorted view of reality. Thus, our subtitle for this series, right? How to say no to the emotions that compete for our control. Because when we're taking our own advice and we think we're calling the right shots, we have this distorted view of reality that's kind of warring within us, and it's based on how we feel, how we react, what other people are doing to us. And so we're going to talk a little bit about that. And we all monitor our behavior. We all are good at monitoring our behavior. I mean, you guys are good at monitoring your behavior right now. Because, I mean, if some of you are like, you know what, I'm not really liking what I'm doing right now. I'd rather be out. And, you're monitoring your behavior by not kind of getting up and walking out. And I thank you for that. We monitor our behavior on a constant basis. We monitor our behavior in order to get a date, right? Like we kind of shape our behavior in some way, shape, or form in order for that person to say yes to going on a date with us. We monitor our behavior in order to kind of, be in that relationship long term a little bit, right? We monitor our behavior all the time. We monitor our behavior so that we can get job interviews, so that we can land the job. Even if what somebody says it doesn't really, like we completely disagree with it, sometimes we will hold our tongue, right? Because we're like, I don't want to say what's really on my mind, because if I say that, I'm not going to get this job, and I kind of need this job. We monitor our behavior all the time. Sometimes. But Jesus invited his followers to take monitoring a step further. His suggestion is so profound that it's made a powerful difference, I think, in the lives of many people, including my own. It's profoundly shaped marriages. It's profoundly shaped parenting, on leadership, all across the board. And if what Jesus says is true, then we all may have some work to do in this area. And so we're going to talk a little bit about this. And I know I certainly do. I did have work to do. I still have work to do. And thanks to this insight, it's easier to identify the bad advice that kind of comes from within. So we're going to take our cue in this series from a passage in the book of Matthew. Matthew was a tax collector. He was despised group within a despised group of that culture in that day. Most tax collectors were corrupt. Jesus came to him one day and asked him to follow him. And that's awesome. And Matthew dropped everything, followed him, and he wrote an account of Jesus' life. And the reason why this is really kind of important and fascinating is because when you're a tax collector, he had access to to people who could write. He had access to scribes who could write in the languages of the day. And so, we have the main language of the day of Aramaic and Hebrew and Greek, and we have all these, and he probably had scribes who were able to write and transcribe and even, kind of go between languages and be able to figure all that out and translate those languages. And so Matthew was a key person, and he had people at his disposal to be able to write exactly the account of Jesus' life in different languages. And so we kind of get this account of Jesus' life that Matthew, it's attributed to Matthew. It probably was written by one of his aides, honestly, but it was attributed to him. We find this in the 15th chapter where we're going to land our text today. It says this: Then some Pharisees and teachers of the law came to Jesus from Jerusalem and asked, "Why do your disciples break the tradition of the elders? They don't wash their hands before they eat." To which a lot of us would say, ew, right? It seems like kind of a ticky-tack thing, though, if I'm being honest. Like the Pharisees, the teachers of the law, are coming from Jerusalem, which means they're coming from a distance away in order to either prove a point or catch Jesus in a trap or try to figure out how they can belittle him so they can elevate themselves. And we've talked a lot about this in the past. So they're coming from some distance away to ask this question: why do your disciples break the tradition of the elders? They don't wash their hands before they eat. And I saw something recently. In fact, I saw it on TV this week. They're talking about how washing your hands is really meant for guys. Let's just be honest. Those signs in the restaurants that say all employees must wash their hands before they're returning to work, that's really just for guys. Because girls, guys are disgusting. And it's just... We probably see that. In fact, I saw that. I was like, you know what? That's not really that big of a deal. Like, if they didn't wash their hands before they eat, I don't wash my hands before I eat all the time. Oh, man. I'm going to do it today, though, at Pizza with the Pastor. I am going to do it today. So if you come out, ew, that's disgusting. But here's the point. They decided you break the tradition of the elders. What is that? And I have skipped right past that a long time. And I would assume that many of us have probably read that verse, if we have read that verse, and we've skipped right over that and kind of gone to Jesus' point, which we're going to get to. But this whole idea of your disciples break the tradition of the elders. Break the tradition of the elders, the traditional rules of the elders. They kind of refer to it as the oral Torah. So we have the written Torah. The Jewish people kind of followed the written Torah. They followed these rules and regulations and these commandments of God, and they followed this written Torah. And people had kind of some access to what they had, what that was. It was passed down. But the oral Torah was something different. The oral Torah was these unwritten rules, if you will, that people had to live by. That the priests and the Pharisees and the teachers of religious law said, hey, these are other rules that you have to live by, and believe me, trust me, these are things that you need to live by. These are rules, and these are traditions These are traditions that we have to do in order to be able to have right standing with God, or rules that you have to do and you have to obey so that you can have right relationship with God. I know it's not written down anywhere, but believe me, it's kind of the unwritten rule. It's the oral Torah. And they were only known by very few leaders. And here's the thing, Jesus didn't buy it. Jesus didn't buy it. And the reason why Jesus didn't buy it was because it made God seem very small, very petty. Like if we don't wash our hands, we're not going to have right standing with God. Kind of petty. Jesus didn't buy it. And so he goes on. They challenge him with this. Why do your disciples break the tradition of the elders, this oral Torah, by not washing their hands before they eat? And Jesus answers them. He replies, why do you break the command of God for the sake of your tradition? Why do you break the command of God? Why do you break the literal thing that's actually written down that we have, that we can see? Why do you break this and just for the sake of this tradition, this unwritten language, this unwritten rule? And he goes on to give them an example on how it says, hey, honor your father and mother. And he shows them how through their oral Torah, through their unwritten rules, through their oral tradition, have created a law, created a rule whereby people will dishonor their father and mother. He kind of calls them out on it in the next few verses and says, hey, why do you break the literal command of God for the sake of your tradition? He points out their hypocrisy. He points out basically their hypocrisy to bypass their responsibility to their parents. And he says, because of that, he goes on and says, you nullify the word of God for the sake of your tradition. You hypocrites. Isaiah was right when he prophesied about you. And then Jesus quotes Isaiah and uses it to transition to a very profound insight. He says, these people honor me with their lips. They've learned to say all the right things. They've learned how to navigate. They learn how to say what's right. They learn how to monitor their behavior in such a way that they can kind of say, they can appear righteous. They know what to say. They've learned how to say all the right things, but their hearts are far from me. They've turned religion into a game that they can always win. And religious leaders have a tendency of doing that, turning the religion into a game that they can always win. And Jesus was really kind of harping on that and saying, hey, you what are you doing? Don't come at my disciples for breaking an unwritten oral Torah tradition where you're breaking the literal command of God that we have right here. Why are you breaking this for the sake of your tradition? You're doing it so that you can have status and prominence, and you can kind of rig the rules of the game so that you can always win. So a crowd gathered, and of course Jesus drops a bombshell idea and kind of walks away after this. He says, listen and understand. Listen and understand. What goes into someone's mouth by accident does not defile them. And God is not small. He's not petty. He's not a gotcha God. You don't get thrown into the penalty box for accidental breach of etiquette with God. He's not this. He says, but what comes out of their mouth, that is what defiles them. He says, what goes into someone's mouth, that is not what defiles them, but what comes out of a person's mouth, that's what defiles them. He walks away, kind of mic drop, walks away. His disciples are walking behind him, kind of turns around to the Pharisees like, man, gotcha. Of course, they had no idea what he said because they come to him later and it's like, did you know that you offended the Pharisees when you said that? And of course, Jesus says in verse 14, he says, leave them. They're blind guides. If the blind lead the blind, both will fall into a pit. The problem was that it sounded like Jesus was kind of dissing their dietary law. And he wasn't. But they kind of needed some reassuring. And as we see on multiple occasions, the disciples are unclear. They're kind of like with Jesus. It sounds like Jesus won the rap battle back there. So they kind of were all on board with Jesus, but inwardly they're going, I don't really get it, what he tried to say, but I'm going to act like I did, but I'm going to ask him about it later. So Peter kind of speaks up for the group, and he asks this question. He says this, explain the parable to us. Explain the parable to us. And of course, Jesus, I find this is playful because in written text, it seems pretty kind of nasty. But I think he was kind of like, playful with, are you still so dull? Jesus asked, are you an idiot? You still don't get it? He stops to explain it. And in the next part of the conversation, we kind of catch a glimpse of what Jesus and God and God the Heavenly Father value most and what we should value most. And here's the spoiler. It says, God is not most concerned with how our behavior affects him. That's something for us to kind of take away today. God is not most concerned with how our behavior affects him. He says, are you still so dull? Don't you see that whatever enters the mouth goes into the stomach and then out the body? And they thought, yeah, we're not an idiot. We see that probably a couple times a day. We eat stuff and it kind of makes its way out. Jesus' point was simply this: if something off limits goes into your body, it moves right through, no harm done to anyone. It just goes. It goes right through. But then he kind of continues. He says, the things that come out of a person's mouth, the things that come out of the mouth are wholly different. These are the things that defile them. And that word defile carries religious implications. It's to be defiled is to put one at odds with God. It's to put one at odds with God. It says those things that go into a person's mouth, those don't defile somebody. But those things that come out of a person's mouth, these are the things that defile them. What comes out of our mouths can put us at odds with people, which puts us at odds with God. That was the bigger overarching point that Jesus was trying to make, that those things that are within you, if they come out, they're coming out because it's something already within you, and that's going to put you at odds with people, and that is going to be what puts you at odds with God more than eating food because you didn't wash your hands. But it wasn't his main part. I left out part of the verse that kind of sets us up for where we're headed over the next few weeks. He says this: the things that come out of a person's mouth comes from the heart. Those are what defile a person. These defile them. The things that come out of a person's mouth come from the heart, and these defile them. They originate from within. They originate from him. The source of your defiling, the offensive words and deeds is within you. It's in you. And we kind of push back a little bit, right? When we're kind of told that, when we're confronted with that idea, we generally will say, no, not everything I say comes from my heart. And we say it like this: sometimes I say things I don't mean, right? Have you ever said that? Sometimes I say things I don't mean. And Jesus probably would push back on this. And he would say, sometimes you say things you don't mean to say out loud, right? You don't say things that you mean to say out loud. Your heart is showing. He says, these are the things that defile a person. They come out of your mouth. They come from the heart. These are the things that defile. And then he gives some examples. And this is what we're going to talk about for the next few weeks. It says, for out of the heart come evil thoughts, thoughts of murder, adultery, immorality, theft, false testimony, and slander. And Mark, who kind of got his account from Peter, had this same story, had the same incident, the same circumstance that he wrote about in his gospel. He added a few in his account. He said, on top of those, murder, adultery, immoral, immorality, theft, false testimony, slander, he goes, greed, malice, deceit, envy, arrogance, and folly. And folly is simply bad judgment. Like our greatest regrets, our regrets relationally were probably the results of bad judgment. Those embarrassing, those despicable, those relationship-killing, financially debilitating behaviors find their source in our hearts. And so what Matthew is saying is that these are what defile a person. And actually, Jesus is the one that's saying it. Matthew recorded it. These are what defile a person. These are what puts you at odds with God because they put you at odds with others. But eating with unwashed hands, he says, those does not defile them. That doesn't put you at odds with God. God is not most affected by or most concerned with how our behaviors affect him. It's how our behaviors affect other people, which will affect our relationship with him. Religious rituals and traditions are often helpful for us, but they don't give us credit with God. How you treat others, how we treat others is what makes him smile. Religious rituals, religious traditions are good. They're helpful for us, but they're not a means for us to have right standing or relationship. They're not these unwritten rules, right? They're not these things that are gonna affect our relation. Missing mass, missing church, missing communion, missing your quiet time aren't the things that defile a person. If you mistreat someone God loves, though, that's a whole other thing. Not washing your hands before you eat. I know that's a bad example, but for us, we can get bent out of shape because we have some traditions. We have some oral traditions. We have some unwritten rules. We have some things that we've been taught growing up. We have some things that we think are important, and maybe they are not really that important. Maybe they're actually more helpful than they are important. They're helpful to us because they give us the posture, put us in a right place to be able to talk to God, to have a conversation with him, to live the way that we're, the way that he's wanting us to live in front of others, but they're not so critically important. Missing church from time to time is not going to change your relationship with God. Now, I would say that, and as a disclaimer, I would like for you not to miss church. I mean, it's not bad for you, right? These things it's helpful to you. But sometimes we can be like, oh, I need to get my life right. I haven't been to church in a long time. Or, oh, I need to do this. I haven't done this. Or I need to have a better prayer life because I haven't done. And some of that stuff might be true, but the things that are rituals, the things that are traditions are there to help you. They're not there to rule over you. They're not laws over you. If being on your knees and praying, that doesn't make you right with God, it might be helpful to get you in the right posture, to have the right focus to be on God. Praying before lunch, is that a law? Is that a ritual and a tradition? It's a rhetorical question. Don't answer that. What comes out of us defiles us. And what we're going to do is we're going to practice monitoring what's in us. What's in us. So it doesn't come out of us. We're going to personalize and name these things that kind of lurk within us. We're going to call them out and let them know, you're not the boss of me. We're going to let these things know that you're not the boss of me. You're not the boss of me. Anger, you're not the boss of me. Envy, I know, like I see that and she has that and I kind of want that and you're not the boss of me. Envy, greed, insecurity, you're not the boss of me. Sometimes I do things because, or I don't do things because I'm fearful, and fear, you're not the boss of me. How different would your life and your relationships be now if you had been taught to monitor what was going on in your heart? If you had been taught to kind of monitor these emotions that were kind of raging within you, how different would your life be? How different would your relationships be if you had been taught to monitor what was going on in your heart? What if your father had not allowed his anger or guilt to be the boss of him? What if your mother had not allowed fear or envy to be the boss of her? For those of us with kids, imagine if we could teach them to monitor their hearts. That when we're talking to them about their day, it's not just, how was your day? Oh, it was good, it was fine, I did this. But hey, how's your heart? What are you feeling? What did somebody make you mad today? Did somebody hurt you? Were you hurt today? Kind of emotionally, like somebody upset you today? Let's talk about that. How does that make you feel? How are you monitoring your heart? How can we teach our kids to monitor their hearts better? Those closest to us experience the overflow of our hearts every single day. We kind of mask it. We kind of sometimes we're ashamed of it. Sometimes we kind of blow it off as, oh, that's not that big of a deal. But those closest to us experience the overflow of our hearts every single day. And that's a big deal. Whether you're a Christian or not, whether you're a Jesus follower or not, it's a big deal. It's an even bigger deal if you're a Jesus follower because we already have a boss of us. We already have a boss of us. We have a better boss than anger or fear or greed or insecurity or anxiety or lust. And this is the invitation that Jesus gives us, and he gives it back in the book of Matthew. He says, come to me. Come to me, all you who are tired, all you who are weary and burdened, all of you who on the surface it looks like a success, it looks like everything's good, it looks like everything's working, you've put a smile on your face, but inside there is a raging fire of emotions that's just kind of boiling up, and sometimes it's making you exhausted because you know it's about to erupt at any moment. His invitation is come, and I'm going to give you something that the world can't give you. I'm going to give you rest. In fact, in another passage, he says, I'm going to give you peace. Peace I give you, and not as the world gives. I'm going to give you peace that the world can't give you. This is what he's talking about. I'm going to give you this rest. I'm going to give you this rest. Follow me and let me be the boss of you, and I'll do something for you because I don't need anything from you. I want to do it for you. I'm going to do something for you that the world can't do for you. I'm going to give you rest. And he goes on and says, take my yoke upon you. And yoke is a cool word. It's so fascinating. Take my way of life upon you and learn from me. Learn from me. For I'm gentle and humble in heart, and you will find peace. You will find rest for your souls. That thing that's within you, that inner turmoil, that thing that's raging, whether it's anger or lust or greed or envy or fear or insecurity, there's emotions that are competing for control of your life. God is saying, Jesus is saying, hey, come to me, learn from me, take my way of life upon you, and I will give you rest for your souls. Follow me, he says, and perhaps your need for supervision will come to an end because I'm going to help you. I'm going to help you silence those voices within. Now, I'm going to put up a few questions just for our reflective purposes. In fact, I'm going to call these discussion questions. And if you're at a Connect group later today or throughout this week, or maybe you're going with some folks at lunch, or maybe you just want to use this and be like, hey, I want to reflect on this personally, that's okay. But here are some questions I want us to think about today as we kind of close up. The first question is this: which of the following has a way of becoming the boss of you? Does anger have a way of becoming the boss of you? Does envy have a way of becoming the boss of you? Insecurity, guilt, fear, greed? Which one of those? Maybe there's one not listed right there. What emotion has the tendency to become the boss of you? And then number 2, what does it sound like when you're taking your cues from your answer to number 1? What do you sound like? What do you sound like to others? What do you start noticing that's happening? What do you start doing? What is it? Is it defense mode? Is it I'm gonna start kind of really getting defensive about something? Am I gonna lash out? Am I going to withdraw? What does it sound like? What are those audio cues that happen when you start taking cues from number 1, when it starts becoming the boss of you? And then number 3, what is the first indication that you're about to hand over control? Now, I will be honest. If you knew the answers to all these 3 of these questions like that, it probably would be pretty easy to get this under control, wouldn't it? I think this is going to take us some time to dig in, to reflect upon. Like you probably know the answer to number 1. That thing that kind of just jumps out. You're like, I know this is an issue in my life. Maybe I try to mask it. Maybe I think I hide it well. I would tell you that those closest to you probably know the answer to number 1 too. And if you were vulnerable enough, if you were transparent enough, if you trusted those closest to you enough, which I think you should, it might be a good exercise to say, hey, what do you think has the tendency to become the boss of me? Maybe it confirms something for you. I know in my life, I think that I've thought I've masked things well, masked emotions well. I think those closest to me probably are like, no, you haven't, Jason. In fact, those closest to me probably are like, no, it's that one, and that one, and that one. You have about 3 of them that you got to figure out. What are those? And what does it sound like? What's the first indication that you're about to hand over control? If we're going to get to the end of this and say, okay, you're not the boss of me, anger, fear, greed, security, envy, lust, whatever. We have to know what that is. But I think the bigger thing is, can we let Jesus be the boss of us? Can we go to him? Can we come to him and take his way of life upon us? Can we learn from him? Because I think that a lot of us have this inner storm that we do a good job of monitoring on the surface, but it's going to erupt. And when it erupts, we offend people, we hurt people. And when we do that, that is what puts us at odds with God. Not these silly religious traditions. I think we get that. But I want you to reflect on these questions, and we're going to go to a time of just response, a time of worship together. And maybe you want to worship. Maybe it's something that you're going to, I want to become close. I want to grow closer to God through this. Maybe this has hit you right in the face, and you're like, you know what? God, forgive me. And you're just going to spend this time just repenting and drawing closer to him. Maybe this is a time where you're just reflecting on these questions. But let me pray for you today.